I'm wondering, with regard to, you talked yesterday, and maybe even alluded to it on Friday, about how Jesus was very careful about how he presented himself, very wise,
Right.
In being careful about it, particularly calling himself the Christ,
Yes.
and the Messiah. And I'm wondering if that, in your mind, is connected to why he was consistently telling the demons and not to talk about him and people whom he healed. Is that the same reason? He was just trying to be careful about that?
I think it's part of it. It is
Okay.
very much a part of it. But let me show you something in response to that. And as part of the material that you have in that Dropbox, there is a chart, and I call it the chronological chart improved. So that's all you've got is the new and improved. But this is my attempt to summarize the 3.5-year ministry of Jesus. And let me... I think
that's in our notes, too.
Pardon me?
I think that's in our notes.
Oh, I think it is. I think it's actually a part of the notes. But at any rate, in this chart, I break the 3.5-year ministry of Jesus basically into two very discernible stages, and this is where you're headed. The first one I call, now this, it's my chart, my titles, but I didn't make this stuff up. But everybody will acknowledge that for the first early months, up until the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus he's engaged in what I like to call, and I do here, public presentation. Now, what I mean by that is that he has to make the case. He has come to offer himself as the long-awaited Messiah. And he is a horrible disappointment in that regard. We were hoping for a warrior. And so to make his case, he goes everywhere. He openly claims to be Christ, the Son of the living God. That's what he claims again and again. But he does it circumspectly, and this is Pastor's point, that, and we made it before, that Jesus does not use the word Messiah, but he uses all these Old Testament word pictures and so on that couldn't be anything else to a Jewish hearing. But, number one, he's openly, but he's doing miracles. And he's telling, go into town and tell everybody what I've done for you. Then, as a matter of fact, I should have started here. I like to begin this discussion by saying you must have noticed that there are times where Jesus does a miracle, says go tell everybody, and then other times where he begs people don't tell anybody. The primary reason, there are secondary reasons, but the primary reason is that after 2.5 years of public presentation, which culminate with two big moments of rejection, and they are the unpardonable sin experience. I won't get into it. And then the feeding of the 5,000. Now, when we think about the feeding of the 5,000, we think, my, such a winsome story, little boy and the lunch, and it reduces itself so happily to a flannel graph. So we've heard that story all of our lives and so on. It's actually one of the more melancholy stories in Jesus' life, because what happens is he feeds the 5,000 on the plain of Bethsaida. The next morning, they find their way back to Capernaum, and in the synagogue of Capernaum, Jesus preaches the bread of life. And his point is, and by the way, time out. Remember, this is another one of those places where, as I've talked about many of you about before, where Jesus finds a way to test what seems to be the willingness of people to follow him. And in this case, he simply says this. And it's interesting because in John's telling, in John chapter 6 and verse 15, after he feeds the 5,000, John tells us, now again, this is the only miracle which is in all four Gospels other than the resurrection. And it's fascinating. But so we learn a lot about this particular miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, and then the walking on water and stilling the storm and the Gadarene. And then the next day, he comes back to Capernaum. And my point is, I never finished. In John 6 and verse 15, it says, after the feeding of the 5,000, they tried to take him by force and make him king. What's that look like? I'm not even sure, but they were pretty excited about him. But the next day, he preached this sermon in which he said, I'll just summarize it, unless you trust in me for spiritual life to the same degree that the Jewish people in the wilderness trusted in the bread from heaven for physical life, you're going to die in your sins. So what he's saying is, it's not enough. Yeah, okay, I can give you physical bread, and you're delighted, and you're only here because you got free lunch. Eat your heart out, Milton Friedman, I like to say. But the fact is that you are, in fact, you need to depend upon me for spiritual life. And then John 6:66, just kind of interesting. John 6:66 says this, then his disciples went back and followed him no more. So this period of public presentation, and everybody who follows the life of Christ really kind of acknowledges this, that there's a huge turning point after the feeding of the 5,000. And now, here's the point, and picking up on Rory's point. The fact is that up until this point, Jesus has never mentioned dying. And he knows he has to broach this issue. And he knows it's going to be difficult, and he is the consummate careful pedagogue. And so the point is, Jesus spends about 4 months trying to get alone with his disciples. And this is what I call private preparation. And Jesus is victimized by his own effectiveness, because he has so effectively blanketed the territory and he has made himself the center of attention in the attempt to present the kingdom, that now he can't get alone. And he goes to Gentile territory. He goes to Syrophoenician. A woman comes, says, please help. And he doesn't want to, but he says, okay. And then there's a big crowd. Then he goes to the Decapolis. He's walking a couple of 100 miles in these 4 months trying to get alone with his disciples. And because he was wise as a serpent, he came up with an idea. And finally, because it finally worked, he got alone with his disciples. He did it by going up to a place called Caesarea Philippi. Banyas. And Banyas is one of the 4 springs that feeds the Jordan system, the Jordan River system, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea. And it's a lush place. It's Caesarea Philippi because it was established by Philip, one of the 3 sons of Herod. And Herod Philip had made it. It's lush. It's beautiful. It's where the Danites settled. There is no good thing wanting here. Remember they said that? And so there low on the slopes of Mount Hermon, Philip established his capital and built a beautiful capital for himself. But he outfitted it to be a place of rest and relaxation and ribaldry, if you don't mind, for Roman troops. So they would come there and they would spend some time, and they were usually drunk, and the whole place was given over to the god Pan, and there was an imperial temple there. In other words, Caesarea Philippi was a place where Jews didn't go under any circumstance. Now, it doesn't say Jesus went to Caesarea Philippi. It says he went to the regions. It's forest. It's deep forest. So I think Jesus took his disciples, and they found a place. The reason they went to those regions because the crowds wouldn't follow him there. And he was clever enough to finally find a place where he could be alone, and he tells his disciples he's going to die, and they're horrified. They're so horrified, by the way, they're scandalized, that they begin to really doubt his messianic claims. And that's why he takes 3 of them, and that's why the Transfiguration. That was all about reinforcing the staggering faith, confidence, belief of the apostles. And that's why when they came down from the Mount of Transfiguration, remember the other 9 were trying to drive out a demon. They couldn't do it. And they said, why couldn't we? And Jesus said, because of your little faith. My point is that Jesus finally tells now, let me say 2 things about it. Number 1, in answer to the original question, why is it that there are times where Jesus says, tell everybody? There are other times where he says, don't tell anybody. It's because it couldn't be more. That's why I say, celebrate the mundane. It's perfectly practical. For 6 months, he's desperately trying to get alone, and he can't do it. And so he tells them, don't tell anybody. Now, this becomes the more important as you get closer to the crucifixion itself, and the enemies of Jesus are working so hard to get him on a cross and so on. He kind of affects a low profile. Now, that makes sense to you? The reason, this is the narrative. You read the narrative, and it's clear that there is a season which he wants everybody to hear. Once they have rejected, and Jesus discerns that they are not going to believe no matter what, he turns to preparing for the cross. And he's going to make his, and at that time, because he has so much trouble, this is Mark 7 and 8, he has so much trouble getting a loan, he begs people not to tell. Does that make sense? Now, full disclosure, there's one other time, and it's early in Jesus' ministry, during this period of public presentation, where Jesus tells a man for whom he has done a miracle not to tell anybody. Don't go into town and tell anybody. There, it's a totally different dynamic. The man was a leper. And so by Mosaic law, if you had leprosy, because it was a different disease than what we know today, and you could recover from it. And they had, I think it was essential oils, but that's a whole different thing. But don't get me, but the point is that they could recover. If you recovered, in other words, it was no longer contagious. You remember the priests had been given all this if it was still pus and all this sort of stuff. And so they would go and present themselves to the priest go to Jerusalem and be inspected and do a small sacrifice before they were allowed to re-enter. Well, here's the thing. Generally, if a person recovered from leprosy, like I say, it's still going to have scars and so on, but it's clearly no longer dangerous. What about if Jesus healed you from leprosy? See what my point? I think very possibly, a baby's bottom might come to mind. You know what I'm saying? Well, if that happened to you, what would be your first impulse? You've been living in a cave. You've been having people come out and throw loaves of bread to you for how many months? And all of a sudden, you're going to run back into town. And because Jesus is born under the law, he's faithful to the law, in that case, he says, don't tell anybody. Go down to Jerusalem and present yourself to the priest. That makes sense to you? So it's a different wrinkle. But when you get into that last half, the last year of Jesus' ministry, and especially during that time when he's trying to get a loan, you have, that's the reason he tells people, don't tell anybody. It's very mundane. But this is a historical narrative, and those details are hugely instructive, and that's what fleshes out. So let me say one other thing, too, and that is this, folks, honestly, this is kind of a thing with me. But like I say, when those 9 apostles were trying to drive the demon out of the boy, they'd done it many times before, and they said, why can't we do this? Jesus said, because of your little faith. Now, let me just tell you, across the board, if you're going to make sense of that, you have to get past the idea, which somehow has wormed its way into our corporate evangelical consciousness. You have to get that past the idea that faith is a strength. Faith is not a strength. I like to say faith is not Popeye's spinach can. Does that work for anybody else in the room? You know what I'm saying? It's not like we can't do it, we need a greater strength. Faith is an admission, I have no strength. Faith is not, your problem is not weakness, it's pride. And the gift of faith has to do with God bringing you to the end of yourself so that you will in fact abandon your pride and fall into the arms of Jesus. So faith is an admission, I have no strength. Now you take that back to where Jesus says the reason you can't is because of your little faith. Doesn't mean that there's some internal spiritual dynamo that's lost its power or something in them. What he is saying is, you've lost your confidence in me. When you drive demons out, you're doing it entirely in you're trusting that my promise and my enablement, and you begin to wonder if I'm really Messiah. And that's why you can't, because you've lost your little dependence. When you see, I think, and I shouldn't go here, I think maybe the most instructive synonym for faith is allegiance. Faith is allegiance. And it comes out of the Old Testament, because you had this dynamic all throughout the Old Testament where you'd have a king sitting on a hill like a kinglet, he's got a walled city, and nomadic peoples, maybe they're tired of being, they'll come and they will form what's called a vassal treaty. And they will say, okay, we will become your people. We will serve you. You will be our king. And there are 2 elements to this. Number 1, we'll trust you for our security. The big issue in the Old Testament period was marauding armies, marauding tribes of bandits and so on. And so you got the walled city, we'll trust you. And on the other hand, whatever you tell us to do, we'll do it. So faith, the kind of faith that God demands that saves and so on, is allegiance. You take yourself off your throne, you put Jesus on the throne, and what? You're going to trust him. He's your security. You're going to obey him. That really is what biblical faith is all about. All right, that's not our point. All right, any other questions? Anybody? Come on. Yes, I'm going to start. She had her hand up first, and besides, she's, yeah, there. Oh, we got a, good.
How come Jesus could say it is finished before he physically died? Why not say that after he came out of the tomb? Like if the atonement was completed and he was still physically alive, what function does his physical death have in the atonement?
Well, if I understand, and come back to me if I missed it, but so the question is, why did Jesus say it is finished before his physical death? I think, listen, I as I said, I think the atoning work was done on the cross, and it was that judicial disfellowshipping by the Father, and that did end, and that's why the sun began to shine again and so on. On the other hand, I make the point that I think death is a bit of an afterthought, but it is very much a part of the curse. And Jesus came to endure all that was involved in that. He came to crush the head of the serpent to gain victory over that entire curse. So it was imperative that he die physically. I don't think that the physical death, I mean, I don't know that you can parse it out quite this much, but it seems to me, given the fact that he says it is finished after the 3 hours of darkness, and then he says, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. He did suffer physical death, and his body laid lifeless in a tomb for those 3 days. But I think so I guess to answer the question, I think it was necessary that he die. But in point of fact, what we're told by the narrative, by the fact that he does pronounce it is finished after the 3 hours, is that was the truly atoning work. Does that make sense? I think, and whenever I say that, I got to kind of stop back and say, now there is some sort of infinitely blessed and real and important divine economy, and God is, and I don't know that we can plumb its depths, but the simple reality is that our sin and our sinfulness is an offense to God. And it's interesting. This is a bit of an aside. Forgive me. I'll just be quick. But it is interesting that in Genesis chapter 3, you have Adam sins, Adam and Eve sin, and immediately God steps forward, and he number one, he makes a promise. And that promise is about the seed of the woman is going to break the curse of the sin, right? The curse of sin. But he does something else. That's Genesis 3:15. On the other hand, go away. I don't know what you're doing here. No thanks. Secondly, he makes a provision. And that's Genesis 3, verse 21. I think it's 21. And that's where he gives them coats of skin. Now, folks, those animals did not zip off those coats, right? What you have is the shed blood, think about this, of an innocent victim, of God's provision to cover the sin of the guilty party. That is the narrative all throughout the Scripture, everywhere, Old Testament, New Testament. You have a promise of a Redeemer, and you have the provision of a blood covering. Now, here's what's curious. We know that in point of fact, that was one promise, that the one who is promised as the deliverer is also the one whose blood is going to cover it, right? When did God make that known? See, I think it's after the cross. It was the cross that taught us that in point of fact, that promised deliverer was also going to offer himself up as the sin covering. So I go back to it. Whatever's going on the cross, it is absolutely consonant with and the culmination of all that God had taught all through those years before the cross. Okay, yeah, friend.
Scripture says that Pilate, after talking to Jesus, sought to release him, but didn't. What did the Jewish leadership have on Pilate to cause him to reverse that effort?
All right, that's a good question, and you've kind of stepped in. But Listen, I could talk about this a long time, but I'll tell you very quickly. Pilate's a fascinating guy. Pilate was an equestrian, which means he came from the second rank of a Roman society. The senatorial rank was the top. He came from he enters very suddenly into Roman annals as far as his role and so on. He was assigned as a prefect to Judea and Samaria. Pilate had a protector. And this guy, you don't read about him in the Bible, but he's really important. The guy's name, and by the way, the emperor here is Tiberius. In the nativity narrative, Matthew and Luke's nativity narrative, Octavian, Augustus is the emperor. But he dies in 13, and now Tiberius is the emperor. And Tiberius, as was often true, he's going to be emperor until he dies in 37. He was the adopted son of Octavian. But he was a man, an absolute lecher. He was a wicked, wicked man who had, on the island of Capri, had his own private estate, and you don't even want to think about it, but just every sort of debauchery but so he really wasn't very interested in running the empire. And so he had a man, and he was the captain of the Praetorian Guard. Now again, the Praetorian Guard, remember we talked about the Praetorium, and that means the Caesar's personal bodyguards. Now these guys were powerful. They were well cared for because these were the guys who could most easily effect a plot against the emperor. They were trusted. And the guy's name was Sejanus. Now Sejanus was, like I say, he was the second most powerful man in the Roman Empire. And in terms of day-by-day activity, he was the most powerful because Tiberius was all getting himself, drunk and high, and Sejanus was actually running things. In October of 31, now, let me back up. I'm going to answer another question. I think it's important. I said to you before that when you do your little arithmetic, and it's quite straightforward, there are only 2 years which it's really possible. There used to be another one that was considered, but it's really not anymore. The year in which Jesus died, 30 and 33. I will argue strongly for 33. All the evidence is for 33. But having said that, Jesus is going to die on Passover, April 3rd of 33 AD. Well, in October of 31, first of all, Sejanus was Pilate's sponsor. And Sejanus put him there, and for a while, the senior official was supposed to be up in Damascus, and that was empty. And so Pilate was kind of on his own, answering directly to Sejanus, and Sejanus was his good bud and the most powerful man. So Pilate was feeling pretty good about himself for a lot of years because he was a very good administrator. He lasted for 10 years. Usually the procurators or prefect, in his case, it lasts 2 or 3 years. But he was. By the way, time out. You ever hear this guy, Paul Meyer? Can't write without putting my hand down. Paul Meyer. Most of his stuff is really worth your time. He wrote a book on Pontius. It's called Pontius Pilate. I really recommend it. It's really well written. And what is the definition of a good book? It agrees with you, right? And so he has the same attitude toward Pilate that I do, but he actually knows something. But the point is, he's a very competent historian. He's chairman of a major university. I remember which one it was, the history department for many years. Strong believer. But at any rate, my point is that in October of 31, Sejanus was found. And one other thing. Sejanus really resented the Jews. There's a very important book called Roman Jerusalem that just compares the two. And he says, his name is Freeman, and he says that there are different estimates, but somewhere between 1 in every 7 and 1 in every 12 person in the Roman Empire was Jewish. So, I mean, they were everywhere, and they were very influential. And Rome was quite deferential. Rome did not demand that the Jews burn the incense to the Roman emperor. Everybody else had to swear allegiance, but they were allowed not to do that. And Sejanus resented it. And he enacted policies that were very deliberately anti-Semitic, very deliberately difficult for the Jews. All right, so with that background, here's the point. In October of 31, Sejanus it was his birthday. And he was invited to the Senate, where they were going to give him the last few prerogatives that would make him virtually a co-emperor. So he was feeling good about himself. When he got there, Tiberius had sent a letter, and in the letter, he revealed a plot that had been discovered where Sejanus was trying to assassinate Tiberius. And so he demanded that the Senate immediately take him out to that stone by the Tiber River and bash his head in. So in October of 31, Sejanus was executed. Now, it's a little mysterious to know how it is that there was quite a purge, you can imagine. But Pilate was good at what he did, and we don't know much about it, but somehow he survived that purge. But now, do you see where I'm going? As of October 31, Pilate didn't have a protector. Furthermore, because what Tiberius did is reverse a lot of those anti-Jewish policies. And so here's Pilate running Judea, the headquarters of Judaism, and he knows that Tiberius is in a mood to support them. And furthermore, there had been two incidents, they're oftentimes overplayed, but there have been two times where Pilate had kind of stepped in a cow pie, you know what I mean, with regard to doing something that made the Jews mad and the Jews to appeal to Tiberius, and Tiberius made him reverse it. So like I say, he'd used up all of his coupons, and he knows he has no protector, and explicit in the text is when the Jewish leaders can't get him to do, they've tried everything, and finally they say, if you don't crucify him, we're going to tell Tiberius. You're not a friend of Caesar's. That's a formal, you get a plaque, put it on your wall, friend of Caesar's. And you want to be a friend of Caesar's. And they say, we'll tell Tiberius. And so, but again, I want to insist that as much as that negative fear and so on, there was also this remembrance that Jesus had pretty much given him permission to go ahead. This isn't your fight. Remember that passage. You're only here because you've been given this assignment. So there really is good explanation historically as to why it was that Pilate, quite frankly, caved, because he did cave. He acquiesced. Now let me tell you one other thing. It's taking it a little far, but it doesn't hurt. I think you're well advantaged to know this. There are those, and especially the unbelieving Jewish community. There is a site, for instance, you can go to. There is a huge, and you might expect this, apparatus or different organizations within the Jewish world, the unbelieving Jewish world, the non-Christian Jewish world, that resist very strongly evangelism in the Jewish world. And there is one called Jews for what? Judaism. So there's a place called Jews for Judaism. And it's kind of my go-to place. I can easily find what are they thinking? How are they reacting? How are they explaining things in order to resist the gospel and the truth of and they will argue, among others, that the story of Jesus and Pilate is entirely manufactured. And this is their reasoning. They say, we have extra biblical references to Pilate that indicate that he's a strong-willed, imperious, unthinking, rather cruel, brutal, heavy-handed prefect. And yet, here you have this story in the scriptures, in the Gospels, of him being very acquiescent. We have him caving in to the Jewish leadership. And so they'll say those two stories don't mix. And so this perceived dissonance between the extra-biblical Pilate and the biblical Pilate is used to argue, well, probably what happened is that it was the Romans who hounded Jesus to death, and the Jewish leadership tried to put a stop to it. And they have all sorts of things. They say they tried to get Jesus to cop to a lesser plea, and they begged with Pilate. Have all these stories they made up about how hard they worked. It's all untrue, and they have no record of it, whatever. They just, this is what we would have done, and we know we wouldn't have done that. And again, their big argument is that the Pilate of the gospel seems so different from the Pilate of extra biblical history. Now, I'm going to say again, the picture of Pilate as a rogue is horribly overplayed. This is tall grass, but there are two ancient Roman historians, Philo and Josephus, both of whom I think commit character assassination against Pilate because they have an axe to grind. They have something they need to make Pilate look as bad as they can for something that's going on. I could take you through it. But however you like that, even I go way back to it. To whatever degree there is a perceived, and I think it may be much more, greatly overblown, whatever degree there is a perceived dissonance between the Jesus Pilate of history and the Pilate of the Gospels, it's really well covered by that issue of Sejanus. He was without Sejanus. And even secular historians will acknowledge that this would have changed everything. And I'm going to add to it one more time, Jesus putting his, looking him in the eyes and saying, this is not your fight, so I think you got to add that. All right, any other questions? All right, it's getting late, so yeah. Nate? Oh, you got to have a microphone. Folks, you got to go? Just go, okay? No.
Okay, real quick.
I don't do briefs.
Yeah.
That's the problem here. But.
You may have addressed this in session 2. I hope I didn't miss it, but if I did. So in Matthew, when Jesus is entering the city of Jerusalem in the triumphal entry, he enters and he goes directly to the temple, according to Matthew and Luke, I believe, Matthew 21. And he cleanses the temple, which doesn't seem very messianic as a king, what a king would do, right? You would suspect that he would go to the gates and storm the fortress Antonio or go to Pilate's residence.
I see your point there.
But Matthew says that the people came, the blind, the sick, and they came and he healed them. Did this not enrage did this confuse them? Could you speak a little bit to how they perceived that action on Jesus' part?
Well, and I was looking for that passage, you remember, but let me take you to this map again. Two things, Nate. Number one, they changed this miserable thing. I can't. Oh, I got to go here. There. Okay. Now, here is the map of the city. Bethany, this is the Mount of Olives. And Bethany, I don't like that black. Bethany is on the backside of the Mount of Olives. The road into Jerusalem kind of goes up north a little ways and then climbs over the Mount of Olives. Now, here's the thing. With regard to his route, you'll often hear that he went in the eastern gate. It's impossible. Number one, we're not even sure there was an eastern gate. Number two, if it was a gate, it was only for priestly personnel, and some people think that that's where the scapegoat was set loose on the Day of Atonement. That's the only reason that gate was there. At any rate, it was no entrance to that gate because you had to make sure, listen, don't go here, Bookman, but there is this remarkable feature of Jewish life at this period called the Mikvah. Have you heard of the Mikvah? M-I-K-V-E-H. The Mikvah is a ritual bath. And you couldn't go into the temple unless you had a token that showed you had been ritually cleansed. And you remember right down here at the base of the city of David, there's a pool called the Pool of Siloam. That's where the man went and dipped, remember, and came up seeing. Remember the John 9, the man blind? Well, that was in the Old Testament, it was Hezekiah's reservoir inside the city, but by now it was a mikvah. And probably on the way, Jesus did, in fact, go and dip himself in the ritual. So my point is, you couldn't just go walking into the temple. There were all sorts of protocols. You had to pass the guard. And it makes no sense. And the other thing is, it's the triumphal entry is about offering and presenting himself. So this is the route Jesus would have taken, absolutely without question in my mind. He comes down. So here he is again on the backside of the Mount of Olives. Now he comes across, and he would have come down the Kidron Valley. It was a important path outside the city walls, and he would have gone in this southern gate. Now, right now, what's going on in Jerusalem right now, it's kind of exciting, and they've been at this for years. Hold on. But right now, they have discovered, they dug it out. We knew it was there, and for years, we'd walk a little, there is Herod the Great totally rebuilt this city. He didn't just rebuild the temple, he rebuilt the city, the whole precinct. And the reason again was, this is the biggest cash cow in his world. He wants the Jews to be making these pilgrimages. But you got crowd control. And so he built a beautiful ceremonial walkway. It's actually 2 walkways. It's very broad. There's a kind of a covered drainage ditch in the middle. And they've uncovered these. You can walk them today. I mean, just in the last 2 months, they've opened this. And those are Herodian, you're walking where Jesus walked. Let me just tell you something. But the point is, that's how you got it. You see, the temple, all right, this is more you want to know. But the city of David is right here. That's the city that David occupied. When Solomon built the temple north of the city of David, where's he going to put the entrance? Well, on the southern wall, because you're coming up from the city of David. So even in the days of Herod, you go there today, they point out the gates of Huldah and so on. So tens and hundreds of thousands of people were there. And this is the route they would take. And Jesus takes that route in order to be seen. That's the point is, he's riding in on a donkey. It's interesting. Zechariah says that he came into the city. He is meek and lowly riding on a donkey. I'm sorry, that's Zechariah 9. And we think, well, that's the meek and lowly part, the donkey. The donkey is not the meek and lowly part. Donkey was a royal steed. And I think Jesus is quietly claiming royalty, quietly by riding in on a donkey. It's also in fulfillment of Zechariah. But the point is, he's there to make the case that he is the king. Does that make sense to you? So he would have gone, and I think what it says is, and Mark alone tells us, Peter, that he came up and he went in the temple, looked around, and went back to Bethany. I think that's probably pretty much the whole day. All right, now, so I think that's the route. Secondly, Nate, what was your second question? Just tell me quick.
It seems odd that he would go.
Oh, yes. All right, very good. And I think there are many ways. As a matter of fact, Zechariah 9:9, it doesn't immediately strike us as all that much. See, predictive prophecies are vindictive. Now, vindicative. Now, they don't want to be vindictive, but they vindicate to the degree that they're unlikely. Does that make sense to you? If I say, you know what's going to happen next year? Tomorrow morning the sun's going to come up. And you say, well, yeah, you wouldn't exactly be staggered at that. You know what I'm saying? If I say tomorrow the sun's going to come up in the west, you'd get your attention if that happened, wouldn't it? So, that's being a little silly. But that prophecy in Zechariah, your king comes onto you meek and lowly. That's not how kings enter their capital city. Generally, there is an entourage, and there's military, and there are banners and trumpets and whatever in the world. None of that. And I think your point is well taken. I've never thought about it, but generally, he would come and take control of the military occupiers. Jesus does none of that. On the other hand, the big issue is Malachi 3, where it says, and Ezekiel 40. But you have these two especially important Old Testament passages where the point is made that Messiah will rule from the temple. Especially that Malachi, the messenger of the new covenant, the messenger of the, there are two messengers in Malachi 3:1, but the second one is the messenger of the covenant, that's the new covenant, will come suddenly to his temple. And that's why it was so telling that's part of the strategy behind the Sadducees coming and saying, by what authority to do these things? Because they expect them to say, well, I'm Messiah, read Malachi, you know this belongs to me. But he frustrates them by, using the John the Baptist argument. So, yeah, it's a good point, and I think it's picking up on Zechariah's point that what you might expect, what you would certainly expect in the coming of a king to occupied territory is not only the pomp and pageantry, but also that he would assault the occupiers. But he does. He just takes control of the temple. Okay, anything else? I'm having all the fun up here, you guys, so if you wait me to run out of gas, you're in bad. That won't happen, but what time is it? Ooh, it's 12:30. Anything else?
Last call for questions.
Yeah, Victoria?
Oh, I'm sorry. Dr. Bookman, you identified the Jews' non-acceptance of Jesus as hypocritical and superficial,
Yeah.
right? Is it possible that the Jews did not see evidence of evidences of the Messiah they expected? So that is an additional reason why they rejected Jesus?
What she's referring to, and I'd invite you to take a look at it, I include in your notes a list of 10 insights, and I just kind of random thoughts that I've had over the years that I think are important to, and one of them is that the point I'm trying to make there, Victoria, is this, that the unwillingness of that generation, leadership and people, Jewish generation, to bow the knee to Jesus' claims is not a function of insufficient evidence. It's not that either the evidence was, as I say, insufficient or ambiguous. Jesus made the claim, and anybody who was honest enough, and this is what I call the Berean strategy. Remember in the missionary journey of Paul, the second journey, he goes to a place called Thessalonica, and the Jews run him out. Then he goes from there to Berea, and it says the Jews in Berea were more, more noble. I like the word, more noble than because they searched the scriptures, that's the Old Testament, to see if these things were so. And, let me broaden this just a bit real quickly. And this is a good principle for you to understand. I said to you before that all throughout his ministry, Jesus made the twofold claim to be Messiah, God come in the flesh. And those two claims are beyond what is easy for us to appreciate, difficult to believe. The claim to be Messiah was disappointing. The claim to be God come in the flesh was blasphemous. Well, think about this. John 20 again says, verse 31, that John is writing that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ. Remember, Christ is Messiah, Christos, Mashiach, same word, the Hebrew and Greek. And you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing you might have life through his name. Now, I like to say that at this point, God in heaven has painted himself into a bit of a corner. Because on the one hand, and I like to say it this way, on the one hand, Jesus made two claims which were on the face of it, both of them, were incredible. Now, folks, forgive me. I beat up everybody, but I always say I may be the last guy in the English-speaking language to know how to use the word incredible, because everything's incredible today. And I'm not going to break you of it, But incredible actually means something. And it's not quite as, that was an incredible sermon. Would it be better for a sermon to be credible? You know what I'm saying? So incredible means unworthy of belief. That's what it means. Now, I know we use it to mean it's so staggering, it's hard to believe that happened, but everything becomes incredible. I heard a guy say, the guy gave testimony in court, it was incredible. I thought, well, let the accused go then, for heaven's sakes. But my point is that Jesus makes two bottomlessly incredible claims. Now, if you don't believe those claims, you're lost. So God has it seems to me, it is up to God to make those two claims, somehow make them not only credible, so that they're worthy of belief, but I think further than that, compelling. So compelling that if you refuse to believe them, he can justly condemn you. This is the point of my point there. And I only know of two steps that God took to do this, to take the incredible claims of Jesus and make them not only credible but compelling. And one of them was miracle, and that's what he does throughout the scripture. And the other is remarkable, stunning Old Testament prophecies which could not be counterfeited and which Jesus fulfilled so perfectly, so that if you go back and simply do the Berean thing, search the scriptures, you're going to come away with saying, man, that's exactly what it says. That can't be a counterfeit. Does that make sense to you? So I react against the idea that if Jesus had worked, you know, God is very much in the business of nailing down the lid of a coffin. You know what I'm saying? And it's, you follow the ministry of Jesus, and he keeps going back and back and back, and to make sure that nobody's going to, there's no fine print here. Nobody's going to be able to say, well, if you just made it a little clearer. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm after. And it really is kind of stunning, not only the miracles, and Nate mentioned it, I had missed this for a long time, that even during the Passion Week on the Temple Mount, Jesus is healing the people who come to him. That throws the unbelief and the anger and the murderous intent of the leaders into rather sharper focus, doesn't it? You know, we got to get rid of this guy. Some guy, you know, walks up and walks away hearing, and, well, we still got to get rid of this guy, you know. I always wonder if, by the way, any of those people had people in their own family. You know what I'm saying? To have people in their own family that got healed. I'm sorry.
No, but you're familiar with what the Jews expected of Messiah at his entry, and that wasn't evidenced at the time.
Right.
So,
well, and what Victoria is referring to, and this gets a little heavy, but I'll say it very quickly. Usually, when you try to reconstruct, when students of the scriptures try to reconstruct the attitude of the Jewish leaders and so on to Jesus, they go to the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is the Encyclopedia Britannica size body of Jewish rabbinical literature. And it includes the Mishnah and then the Gemara, which is commentary on that. I won't get into it. It's very convoluted. But the point is, and the Talmud does, I have a quote in your notes from the Talmud, which cites a first century rabbi, but it wasn't written. This is so important. The Talmud began to be written in about 250 AD. So about 200 years after Jesus, this actually began to be written. And by that time, and this is a scathing indictment, but I think it's demonstrable, by that time, the Jewish world had set itself in opposition to Christianity. They defined themselves. Now, I love all things Jewish. And I love the land of Israel. I love to be there. But the reality is that, I'll give you an illustration. You know what it is to make aliyah? Are you familiar with that? To make aliyah, A-L-I-Y-A-H. It's actually the word that's used again and again in the Old Testament. When you go up to Jerusalem. Aliyah is up. But to leave your home anywhere else in the world and move to Jerusalem as a Jew and settle in to support the home state, that is to make aliyah. It's celebrated. Oh, they encourage it, and it's huge. It's an amazing movement. And they will, and from the time they were formed as a state, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, and it seemed impossible, and they've stood by it nobly. Their policy has been, if you're Jewish and you get off the boat that quick, you're a citizen. We'll find you a place to live. We'll find you a job. We'll teach you Hebrew. We'll give you medicine. We'll train your kids. If you're Jewish, you get off that boat, and you're one of us, unless you're a Christian. If you're an evangelical Christian, to this day, they won't let you in. And you got to get a lawyer, and you got to, it's this huge, hideous, I say hideous, it's just, and it doesn't always work. So I got friends who are very Jewish and got a heart for Israel, just wanted to go back with a business. They weren't going to leech anybody. One guy had a plumbing business, and he had it all set up, and he knew where he was going to go. They wouldn't let him in, simply because he is a believer in Jesus. Now, what that suggests, and this is serious indictment, and I think it's a function of, spiritual realities. But today, even the Jewish community doesn't define themselves in terms of what they believe, but what they don't believe. You can be Jewish and be Buddhist, that's okay. You can be Jewish and be Muslim, to be honest with you, but not as much. But you can certainly be Jewish and be atheist. Most of them are in Israel and even in America, at best agnostic and mostly atheist. But you can't be Christian. Now, where am I taking you with that? My point is simply this, that by the time the Talmud is written, the Jewish community, especially the leadership which is writing the Talmud, is primarily about resisting Christianity. It's exploding, it's invading. And so they are framing themselves in their thoughts. Now, they got the Berean problem. They know that the reality is, if you simply go back to their scriptures and ask the question, does the Nazarene fulfill these prophecies, these anticipations? Absolutely he does. Perfectly. There's no point at which Jesus fails in any specific recognizable anticipation of what Messiah should be. Now, he's not a conquering Messiah yet. That's the mystery of the two comings in 1 Peter. But does that make sense to you? So the Jewish world, and this is this is heavy. The Jewish world, in order to deal with that reality that their own scriptures, if simply read, will lead to the conclusion that Jesus is in fact Messiah. And therefore, quite frankly, and I can trace how this happened primarily through a thinker named Philo, they invented a hermeneutic. And it is the spiritualizing hermeneutic. It is the idea that there is some mysterious coded meaning to those words on the page. And you can't simply read those words and know what they say. The rabbi has to tell you what they say. And so rather than studying the scriptures today, one of the realities that Jewish evangelism outfits, I worked with Friends of Israel for several years, one of the reasons one of the things they encounter is that Jews do not know their own scriptures. You assume they do. You assume you can talk about Daniel and the lion's den, they know what you're talking about. They have any idea. Because they're not allowed to read their scripture. I mean, it's not quite that, but they're not encouraged. And what they're taught is that if you read the scripture for yourself, you'll think they mean what they say. They don't mean that. They mean something else. And so they developed a hermeneutic, which was designed not to help them understand the scriptures, but to help them avoid what the scriptures were saying. Now, that's a severe indictment, but it's not mine, and I think it absolutely. Now, let me tell you something. Philo, a Jewish thinker from Alexandria, who was a lot more committed to Socrates than he was to Moses, but Philo was the guy, and he wanted to be able to read the Hebrew scriptures consistent with the Greek philosophers, which can't be done. And so he introduced this, and then Philo taught it to a guy named Origen, who taught it to a guy named Augustine, and therefore it came into the Christian world. And this whole body of people who insist that, well, you can't, when you got to spiritualize, you got to allegorize. When it says 1,000 years, doesn't mean 1,000 years, just means a long time. And so that whole debate today in our world between, do you read the Bible literally, in which you believe that Jesus is yet to come to establish a kingdom, or do you read it allegorically, and you wax nose it, and you make it say what you need it to say, in which case you can argue that Jesus already came and established a kingdom, and it's just God's rule in your heart, and he's never coming back. I mean, he's not going to reign on this earth. My point, though, is this, that I'm going to go back to it. That mentality only begins to manifest itself in ways that we can trace about 250 AD. So you go back to Jesus' day, and I think, and this is the Berean thing. It was a synagogue of Jews in Berea who said, okay, let's do it, and got their scrolls out and started going through them, looking, well, look at there, look at there, look at there. Sure enough, Jesus, this Nazarene. Now, they didn't know him personally. Paul was telling them, but that's what he says. That's sure, it matches. So it is, in fact, the great bane of human history, in my mind, is spiritualizing hermeneutics. That is, insisting that there are secret coded meanings that only the erudite and informed can really discover, and you can't read it for yourself. It's what gave us, to the degree to believe there was a dark ages, that's what gave it to us, You take the Bible out of people's hands, not physically, but by just telling them, it doesn't make any sense to you. And that's what Mike Rydelnik, do you know that name? He's got a radio program. He teaches at Moody. He's a good friend. I love the guy. But he has a book called The Prophetic Hope, and in it he tells about his own experience. And he tells about he was raised, I can't remember where, I think it was in New York, but he had a very Jewish family. And I think it was his sister, but it might have been his mom, but I think it was his sister who came to the Lord. And they would have all these arguments, and he was studying the Talmud, and he had all these rabbinical arguments, and she would try and take him to the scriptures, and he would deflect and say, but the rabbi says, and the father say, and all this sort of stuff. And finally, she just said, all right, I'm done. She said, Mike, you know enough about what Christians claim about Jesus that you can see it. I'm begging you, leave all that behind. Read your own scriptures. Start anywhere you want. Read your scriptures and tell me if you don't see Jesus. He got saved. He teaches at Moody for all these years. But that's what has to happen. They have to leave the habit of mind, which has been very carefully developed, and just let the scriptures be the scriptures. Let them say what they're trying to say.